the story of the opera house that inspired the novel. In the mid-1800s, a new Paris opera house was proposed to occupy one of the city's prime locations. It was not until December 1860 that the Ministry of Fine Arts instigated a competition for a state-funded building worthy of the location. There were 171 entries, which is remarkable in that only a month had been available in which plans could be prepared. The judges decided after sifting through some 700 separate drawings that the outstanding ones were those of Charles Garnier, then 35, and a comparatively unknown architect. He had won the Grand Prix de Rome at the age of 23 and had acquired a reputation for romanticism. During construction, we can already see inspirations for the Phantom story. Work began on the site in the summer of 1861. Garnier's energy and ingenuity were quickly put to the test. Initial excavations revealed an underground stream running through the site, which had the effect of turning the soil into mud, making it unstable for the laying of foundations. An engineering solution had to be found. For nearly 8 months, the local residents were driven mad by the pounding din of 8 huge steam pumps working without pause, day and night, to dry out the saturated subsoil. In doing so, lowering the water table sufficiently to dry up every well in the vicinity. Then Garnier built a double-layered concrete foundation sealed with bitumen to resist water seepage. The work was interrupted on July 21, 1862, when Count Walewski, the Minister of State, laid the foundation stone with due ceremony. It continues. The watery footings were turned to advantage. A lake was created deep beneath the stage area in the darkness of the 5th basement, and water from it was employed in the operation of hydraulic stage machinery. The lake remains to this day, although no longer used for that purpose. It acts, however, as an on-site reservoir in the event of fire, and every few years is drained so that the foundation structure can be inspected. Normally, there's only a couple of feet between the water surface and the brick-vaulted ceiling, but when the level is lowered, there is plenty of room for the examination to be carried out from a boat. Provisions were also made in one of the lower basements for the stabling of 20 horses, which would be used in some of the more spectacular productions, and brought up to stage level by a gentle ramp. The opera, as might be expected for so ambitious a design, took an eternity to build. The facade was unveiled in 1867, but there were holdups due to financial shortfalls when the government of the day drew in its horns. The eventual cost of the building was 47 million francs. The secret underground lake where the Phantom made his home. A painstaking researcher, Leroux explored every inch of the opera before writing his novel. He remembered particularly the sinister lake in the depth of the building, where he stumbled over the bones of a prisoner who had died during the Commune. During the Franco-Prussian War, even before the opera was finished or could stage its first performance, it says here, the unfinished opera house building was taken over for use as an arsenal and a warehouse for storing vital food supplies and 1 million liters of wine. There was not enough. Now Paris endured black days of siege encircled by the Prussian army for 19 weeks through a grim winter. The animals of the zoo were slaughtered and the carcasses sold to restaurants so that the rich could eat elephant meat while the poor managed on dogs, cats, and rats. Paris was on fire from German shelling. The people starved and the streets ran with blood. At the point when hope ran out, there was no option but to surrender. But shortly after the military occupation ended, members of the disbanded National Guard, who were still armed, took on the provisional government. Soon the communards had an army of 100,000 men, and cannons spread throughout sections of the city which had been shamefully abandoned by the politicians in the belief that the uprising would eventually peter out of its own accord. The opera now performed the role of observation post, communication center, powder store, and military prison. In the dense labyrinth of stone stairways, underground passages, and vaulted chambers of the basements there was ample room in which to incarcerate enemies. The communards were eventually smashed by government forces in a battle at the Père-Lachaise cemetery. The last act of the Commune was the burning of major public buildings, including the Hôtel de Ville and the Louvre, where luckily only the library perished. But the bloody episode was a sinister pre-birth for Garnier's great building, and in some of the opera's deep cellars, which seem to extend into the dark infinity of Pyrenean voids, there is a perpetual chill that no amount of modern electric lighting seems able to dispel. It is easy enough to imagine that the first notion of the great building being haunted by tormented spirits took hold during the period of the siege and the Commune. Another 3 years were to pass before the opera was ready to stage its first performances. The building, which had been conceived in the reign of Napoleon III, its foundation stone laid in 1862, was not inaugurated until France was well into its Third Republic. The gala opening was a signal that Paris had come fully alive again after the privations of 4 years earlier, and it marked the beginning of a glorious era of cultural excitement, elegance, and high living that was to become known as La Belle Époque. It was not even finished. Among the areas that still awaited the final coat of varnish was the special reception area that was to have been Napoleon III's salon, reached via a sweeping exterior ramp, but which was now to be reserved for the head of state. Today, this wing overlooking the Rue Scribe houses the opera library and the adjoining museum. Covering a site of nearly 3 acres, or 118,500 square feet, the new building stood 17 stories high, 7 of them below street level, with basements so large that stage sets could be stored complete before being raised to serve their turn before the audience. The costume and property departments, workshops, and other functional necessities were amply provided for. The flies soared several stories above the stage. At roof level, the opera was a romantic, spiky jumble of domes and cupolas, pinnacles and sculptures, offering the brave and hardy who had the stamina to make the unofficial climb a vantage point from which to look down on Paris. Charles Garnier's Opera House was the 13th in Paris, but one of the few still standing to this day. Look at that attention to detail and design, even behind the main staircase. Gaston Leroux. He was a graduated law student, yet his heart was set on writing. Working for different magazines and papers, with his background he was able to cover everything from theater to courtroom events. After many travels, experiences, and dangerous journalistic assignments, he eventually decided to become a full-time novelist. Between 1908 and 1918, he had published a whole list of novels, but one he had published in 1911 would become his most famous. It says here, but by now he had written the book which was to guarantee his immortality. Even if the latter-day public after his death would know little of its author, or that it was one work among scores of others, The Phantom of the Opera was published in 1911 and surprisingly attracted very little attention in the first weeks. Leroux claimed to have been inspired to write the story after visiting the Paris Opera House and roaming through its lower depths, in those labyrinthine cellars and the mysterious subterranean lake, which was visible through iron grills in the floor only if a torch was lit to pierce the blackness. There was an atmosphere that seemed to demand that a yarn be told. There were still visible traces from the period of the Franco-Prussian War and the Commune, when the place had been a prison, with various cellars transformed into dungeons. Prisoners held there had no chance of seeing the light of day, being far below street level. It needed little imagination to appreciate their plight. Leroux also remembered the unfortunate accident of 1896, when one of the chandelier's counterweights had fallen on the audience, and the resulting horror. He tried to visualize the consequences of the chandelier itself dropping when the auditorium was full. He found that the long gestatory period of Garnier's building, which was under construction for 14 years, offered certain possibilities, affording a well-placed person with a serious architectural background the time and opportunity to create within the complex honeycomb of passages and chambers all manner of secret routes which would be known only to himself. Thus he gave Eric, the Phantom, the training and the vocation of an architect, as well as his passion for music. Leroux began his book with an introduction in which he averred that the opera ghost really existed. The subsequent narrative was based on that assumption, the author presenting his researches in a vivid and seemingly authentic manner. By using the devices of the journalist, he assembled various documentary items and a mass of background detail, and gave the story a convincing air of verisimilitude. Leroux may well have invented the faction style of novel writing, in which real characters, events, and places are interspersed with the fictional elements of the narrative with such precision that the join between truth and imagination is blurred to the point of invisibility. The first story. This is basically just a synopsis. In 1942, Carl Laemmle, president of Universal Pictures, took a vacation to Europe. In Paris, Laemmle met Leroux, who gave him a copy of The Phantom of the Opera. As one film man to another, and confessed to him how excited he had been gazing at Garnier's opera house from the Place de l'Opera. Leroux, sensing some interest, gave Laemmle a copy of The Phantom of the Opera for his bedtime reading. Apparently, that night, Laemmle stayed awake, intent on getting through the entire story. By the next morning, he had determined that it should be made into a film, but one that could be shot back home in the Universal Studios, rather than in Paris. In those days, it was cheaper to build a replica of the Paris Opera on stage in a Californian film studio than to send a cast and crew to Europe. In any case, his company was already committed to another Paris story, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, and a huge outdoor set, which included a monstrous replica of the cathedral, was in the process of erection on the back lot. The star of that film, playing the misshapen Quasimodo, was Lon Chaney, whose ability to undergo fearsome physical deformation in the assumption of his roles had already earned him a legendary reputation. He was a master of makeup, the man of 1,000 faces, and although his appearances were frequently grotesque, he was able to project a degree of pathos sufficient to win the sympathy of the audiences. To play the hunchback, he wore on his back a rubber hump that weighed 40 pounds and twisted his body with a fearsome leather harness that weighed another 30 pounds. Such was his dedication that box office success was assured, and Laemmle found his star being lured away by Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. In his view, Chaney was the only actor who could ensure the success of the Phantom project, and he was obliged to enter into expensive negotiations with MGM to acquire his services. The MGM president, his deadly rival, Louis B. Mayer, at first was reluctant to loan Chaney at all, but eventually agreed after an intervention by his young associate, Irvin Thalberg, who had cut his teeth as a producer at Universal. Thalberg argued that the Phantom could be the most significant role of Chaney's career. Chaney, too, was delighted to find himself back at his old studio for a much higher salary. Meanwhile, it was decided that the principal set of the film was to be the Opera House itself, and the building of the replica was begun on Stage 28 at the Universal Studios. Because the auditorium would have 5 tiers of boxes to be crammed with hundreds of extras, it was decided that the customary method of set construction on a wooden framework would be inadequate and unsafe. Accordingly, it was the first Hollywood set to be based on a steel framework implanted in concrete foundations. The skeleton was later covered with wood and reinforced corrugated iron. So soundly was this huge indoor set built that it has never been struck. It still stands on Stage 28 to this day, and has appeared in many films over the years whenever a large auditorium is required, including the 1943 version of The Phantom of the Opera, several Deanna Durbin pictures, Ronald Colman's Academy Award-winning A Double Life in 1948, Alfred Hitchcock's Torn Curtain in 1966, and The Sting with Robert Redford in 1973. The famous Universal City Tour, which is one of the largest tourist attractions in the western United States, includes Stage 28 on the itinerary, and it is visited by many thousands of sightseers every year. For that reason alone, there has been a justification in keeping it standing, and it survives, a link with the old silent Hollywood of more than 60 years ago. A tank had been built under the floor of the stage in order that the lake scenes and the Phantom's lair could be filmed. The backstage part of the set was fitted out so comprehensively that all the necessary equipment, scenery, and props for the staging of a real opera were present. The roof, including the huge statue of Apollo, was built to full scale, and the Paris skyline was added with a glass painting mounted in front of the camera. Another spectacular area of the set was the grand foyer with the double staircase, a perfect setting for the masked ball, one of the most spectacular sequences in the film. 10 weeks after filming had started, a rough assembly of the footage was shown to the studio hierarchy led by Laemmle, who found the pace too slow. As a consequence of the showing and the history of problems with Chaney, Laemmle ordered that Rupert Julian be replaced by Edward Sedgwick, an action and comedy director. It was he who shot the mob and chase scenes at the climax of the film. Then, following Los Angeles previews in January 1925, Sedgwick was asked to add a new subplot. The premiere was in San Francisco on April 26, 1925, and even after it had taken place, it was decided to withdraw the print, remove the additional material, and instead to intersperse a few comic moments, using the Mack Sennett comedian Chester Conklin as a portly stagehand. When the new print was shipped to New York, the East Coast backers viewed it with stupefaction, finding that the storyline made little sense, so now the comedy was excised, the whole film re-edited, and a new set of title cards was hastily prepared to cover the strange editing shifts. The 1925 release prints showed signs of the massive tinkering the film had undergone. Some sequences, such as the opening ball and the masked ball, were shot in the old 2-color Technicolor process, which required greatly enhanced lighting, but the rest of the film was in black and white, with occasional use of tinted stock for the release prints, a common practice at the time. Given such a checkered production history, it is surprising that the film could have turned out so well. That it did, and became a major box office hit of the year in America, was largely on the strength of Chaney's performance, which overcame the glaring continuity lapses. Chaney had astutely arranged for a contractual clause prohibiting the use of any photographs of his Phantom makeup before the film was released, a suggestion with which the studio concurred. He had resolved to make it a tour de force that would strike terror throughout the audience, and he succeeded. There's a classic moment in the film when Mary Philbin snatches his mask off from behind, the revelation as Chaney faces the camera with his horrific countenance exposed, and then turns to confront Philbin, who is overcome with terror, sent such shudders through the audience that theater managers were urged by the distributor's publicists to lay in stocks of smelling salts for nervous ladies who were likely to faint at the awful sight. Contrary to popular belief, Chaney's makeup was not based on a mask, but on his real face. He inserted a wire device into his nose to push his nostrils apart and give it an upturned look. He placed celluloid discs into his cheeks to change the facial shape. Drops in his eyes produced the bulging, pop-eyed look. The result was one of the greatest contributions to the iconography of the silent cinema. Typically, Chaney set himself a task that would have daunted most actors, and succeeded, for in spite of the macabre and repulsive appearance, he was able to project so much compassion and sorrow that it was perfectly possible to feel sympathy for this misshapen creature. Chaney's parents had been deaf mutes, and from his earliest childhood he had been obliged to signify his feelings through expression and gesture, which was a contributing factor to his success as a silent star. He only made one talking picture before his death from bronchial cancer in 1930. But Chaney's phantom look was also hard to imitate. James Cagney came nowhere near it when he played Chaney in the 1957 film biography, Man of a Thousand Faces, another film which used the Opera House set on Stage 28. The flight from the pursuing mob, shot by Edward Sedgwick, while very dramatic, is not part of Leroux's narrative. It could cynically be suggested that it presented an opportunity to make use of the leftover sets from The Hunchback of Notre Dame, and since it takes place by night, the medieval character of the architecture is less apparent, except for one superb camera angle which embraces the intricate west front of Notre Dame itself. The fury of the mob as they fall on Eric and hack him to death is both callous and gruesome, and the film ends somewhat abruptly, with his corpse disappearing into the murky waters, with the word "Fini" superimposed as soon as they have closed on the remains. 2 years after The Phantom of the Opera was released, Warner Brothers brought out The Jazz Singer and started the talking picture revolution. The silent picture was doomed, and studios not only hastened the transition to sound, but looked closely at their existing product to determine whether or not it was suitable for adaptation to the new medium of talkies. In 1930, dialogue sequences were shot for The Phantom of the Opera with Mary Philbin and Norman Carey, and music and sound effects were added to the whole film. Some sections were eliminated altogether, while singing voices were added to the various scenes from Faust that were incorporated in the action. Mary Philbin's singing was dubbed none too satisfactorily, as the technique was then in its infancy. Lon Chaney's voice was purported to be heard, but actually dubbed by someone else, since he was not involved in the sound version, and died in the same year. Although only a third of the film had dialogue and singing, it was advertised with the line, talking, singing, dancing, sound effects, music, color, and so the first Phantom on film enjoyed a renewed lease of life. Claude Rains attacks the chandelier in the 1943 film. Claude Rains wears the mask of the Phantom. The Phantom leads Christine, Susanna Foster, to his lair. Herbert Lom as the Phantom in the Hammer version of the legend. Lom unmasked in the 1962 film, directed by Terence Fisher. William Finsley as Winslow Leach in The Phantom of the Paradise, a rock variation directed by Brian De Palma in 1974. Jane Seymour and Maximilian Schell in the 1982 version made in Hungary for CBS television. Sarah Brightman as Christine. Sarah Brightman and Steve Harley from the promotional video for The Phantom of the Opera. Sarah Brightman and Cliff Richard from the video All I Ask of You. Michael Crawford from the video Music of the Night. Hal Prince directs. Charles Hart, he wrote the lyrics. Andrew Lloyd Webber, he wrote the music. Sarah Brightman and Michael Crawford. Gillian Lynn, dancing choreographer and director. Writer Richard Stilgoe. Masquerade dummies hoisted on bars under the fly floors in the wings. Annie Partridge, the deputy stage manager, in the prompt corner. During a performance, she gives 350 cues. Alan Hatton, the stage manager, adjusts a dummy for the masquerade. The show is on. Cast members wait to go on stage. The wig room at Her Majesty's Theatre. Wigs prepared and ready for a performance. The Skullhead staff, from which the Phantom shoots fireballs. The musical box, a figure of a monkey in Persian robes playing the cymbals, whose quaint, haunting theme recurs throughout the production, reminding us of the tender relationship between Christine and the Phantom. A dressing room scene at Her Majesty's. Organized chaos gives way to another perfect performance. The ballet girls are instructed by Madame Giry. Their tutus are made of 12 meters of tarlatan, a kind of stiffened muslin, as were the original tutus of the Degas period. The layers of skirt are edged using pinking scissors. The bodice is made of linen. Each girl used 12 pairs of ballet shoes per month. Michael Crawford being lowered in the Angel for the roof of the Opera House scene. The dummies for Masquerade are set in position on the grand staircase. A stagehand supervises the grand staircase, folding away to lie flat against the back wall of the stage at the end of Masquerade. The false stage. The audience applaud Christine as she takes her bow after her gala opening night. View of the orchestra with musical director Michael Reed. Maria Bjornson, brilliant designer with the English National Opera and Royal Shakespeare Companies. Phantom was her first mainstream musical. Cameron Mackintosh, she's a genius. Some of Maria Bjornson's models of the sets. Hal Prince used these to introduce the cast to the production and talk them through the plot. A selection of Maria Bjornson's costume designs. Male singers in the Hannibal scene. The female chorus for Hannibal. The managers. Slave masters in the Hannibal scene. A selection of Maria Bjornson's masquerade designs. Michael Crawford has his makeup applied by Tiffany Hicks. The daily procedure takes approximately 2 hours, but before it begins, the face must be moisturized and the hair wetted down. The face shaved very closely, and every 2 or 3 days, the neck as well. Once the glue is applied to the prosthetics, the foam latex pieces that make up the Phantom's face, they cannot be altered as they set in place immediately. After 1 hour, Tiffany paints highlights and shades the Phantom's face, and 2 wigs are fitted, together with the radio mic. Last of all, the 2 contact lenses, one white, one dark blue, are put in. After the performance, the makeup is removed very carefully with oil and a brush. Great care must be taken not to damage the skin, because if injured, it has no chance to heal before the next performance. The Principals, photographed by Terry O'Neill before opening night. The stage set for the start of Act 1, the auction. The chandelier is hoisted upwards as the drapes fly, and the Phantom's theme is heard for the first time. One of the drapes from Act 1. This was specifically dyed and printed from an original design. For the show, 2,230 meters of fabric were used for the drapes, 900 of them specifically dyed. The tasseled fringes amount to 226 meters, made up of 250 kilos of dyed wool with 5,000 wooden balls, imported from India, interwoven. Each one is handmade and combed through with an afro comb. The chandelier in the production weighs 3/4 of a ton and was built by 5 people in 4 weeks. It is made up of 6,000 beads, 35 beads to each string. Separating each bead is 3 knots. If a knot becomes loose, there is the backup from the other 2 knots to prevent the beads from falling into the auditorium. It is regularly inspected by the local authorities for safety purposes. Hannibal. A shot of the Hannibal elephant taken from The Flies. John Aaron as Bianchi, playing Hannibal. Raoul and the managers watch Christine. Christine sings at her gala, Think of Me. Christine and Raoul meet in her dressing room after her gala. Meg asks Christine about the teacher who has taught her to sing so beautifully. The Phantom takes Christine through the mirror of her dressing room. The mirror dissolves as she disappears into it, leaving her room empty. The Monkey Girl costume from Masquerade. A detail from some of the fine materials used. The dual-sex costume was made by a husband and wife team. The male half was made by the husband, an experienced tailor, while his wife, a dressmaker, attached the female part. A selection of masquerade costumes. All the costumes were designed by Maria Bjornson and supervised by Sue Wilmington. They were made up by 35 different costumers from all over Britain. There are approximately 12 to 15 meters of fabric and 60 meters of braid in each costume. They are minutely detailed and meticulously put together. More costumes by Maria Bjornson. With a few exceptions, most of the cast have approximately 7 costume changes. The masquerade costumes incorporate fabrics and accessories bought in Southall, West London, where there's a large Indian community. So much braid was purchased over the weeks of preparation that the costume supervisor's car became known as the Braidmobile. Complementing the costumes, there are a total of 150 wigs used in the show. 5 people have to work daily on them, starting at 10 in the morning, For instance, Christine's wig is made of real hair and has to be rolled up on sticks to be set. This takes 1 hour. It is then baked in an oven for 5 hours, after which it is combed out and styled to give the sensational pre-Raphaelite look. Don't be fooled into thinking there is a real person in this costume. It is in fact a dummy. The Phantom has composed a new opera. Christine rails, "I cannot sing it, duty or not." Piangi, at the rehearsal for the Phantom's opera, experiences difficulty with his notes. Christine sings, "Wishing you were somehow here again."